Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at productivity and special tax regimes in the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
We've got some really fascinating research here from Marvin Cardoza of the Dominican Tax Authority and Rodrigo Azuero Mariano Bosch and Dennis Sanchez of the Inter-American Development Bank.
Okay.
They've all teamed up to try to answer this big question.
Yeah.
Why isn't the Dominican economy as productive as it could be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the things that they point to in their research is this idea of misallocation of resources.
This allocation of resources.
Yeah, so it's not just about having resources. It's about making sure that those resources go to the businesses that can use them most effectively.
Okay, so this is kind of like, I'm thinking of a garden.
Yeah.
You've got limited water, you've got limited fertilizer
Right.
to help your plants grow. If you keep pouring those resources onto the plants that are already struggling, the whole garden suffers.
Exactly.
Is that the basic idea here?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the Dominican Republic's productivity is only about 55% of the United States, and that gap has actually been widening for decades.
Wow.
And their research suggests that if resources were allocated efficiently, the country's total factor productivity, or TFP, could actually be double what it is today.
Double.
Yeah, we're talking about a potential increase in GDP of 44%.
Okay, 44%. Now, that's a number that really drives home the point.
Absolutely.
But how do you actually measure something as complex as misallocation?
Well, they used a methodology that was developed by economists Shia and Klenow.
Okay.
And essentially what it does is it looks at the productivity of individual firms within an economy
Right.
and calculates how much more productive the entire economy would be if resources were perfectly allocated to the most efficient firms.
So it's kind of like figuring out how much bigger our garden could be if we were watering the right plants.
Precisely.
Okay. Now, where do these special tax regimes come in?
Right. So the Dominican Republic has a rather complex tax system.
Okay.
In addition to the kind of standard taxes that all businesses pay, they have these special tax regimes that offer incentives to specific types of companies.
So things like tax breaks, exemptions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And these regimes are often designed to attract investment in certain sectors like tourism or free trade zones.
Yeah, that makes sense on the surface. But what does this research tell us about how these special tax regimes are actually impacting productivity?
Right.
Are they helping or are they hindering?
Well, that's where things get right interesting. The research shows that the firms that are operating under these special tax regimes tend to be larger.
Okay.
They tend to be older, and they tend to be more reliant on things like machinery and equipment compared to the firms that are under the general tax system.
So you would think that those firms would be the productivity superstars.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But that's not always the case.
Really?
Yeah, some of these firms actually show lower productivity despite the advantages that they get from these special tax regimes.
Wait, so they're getting tax breaks but not necessarily performing better?
Right.
That seems a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does raise the question of whether these special tax regimes might actually be propping up inefficient firms.
So like going back to our garden analogy, it's like we're giving extra water to the plants that are already wilting.
Exactly.
While the healthy ones are struggling to get their share.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. Larger, older firms, not necessarily the most productive, being kept in the game by these special tax regimes.
Yeah.
What about newer companies?
Yeah.
Do they get a boost from these regimes, at least in the beginning?
Well, that's where the findings get a little bit more nuanced.
Okay.
Younger firms and special tax regimes do seem to experience faster growth initially, but that advantage tends to disappear over time.
So a short-term sugar rush, but no long-term gains.
Exactly. And it really raises questions about the sustainability of this type of growth.
Okay.
And then there's kind of another layer of complexity here.
Okay, I'm listening. What else should we consider?
Well, the study also highlights the potential for tax evasion and strategic behavior due to the complicated nature of these special tax regimes.
So are you saying that some companies might be taking advantage of loopholes?
Yeah.
Or finding ways to game the system
to
get the biggest tax breaks, even if it doesn't lead to real improvements in productivity?
That's one of the key takeaways here, and I think it has implications beyond just the Dominican Republic.
Right.
It raises some important questions for policymakers in any country that has a complex tax system.
Yeah.
Are these special tax regimes truly helping?
Right.
Or are they actually hindering the overall economy?
That's a really important point. You can't just assume that a policy is working because it sounds good in theory.
Exactly.
You have to look at the actual impact.
Absolutely. And I think this research gives us valuable data to start to understand that relationship between tax policy and productivity.
So after digging into all of this research, What are the big takeaways for you?
Hmm.
What are the key things that we should be thinking about after this deep dive? I think for me, it's just a reminder that we can't just assume that tax breaks and incentives automatically lead to a stronger economy.
Yeah.
Sometimes they can actually make things worse, right?
Right.
By, distorting the market or propping up businesses that aren't actually that efficient.
Exactly. And, policies that sound really good in theory don't always play out the way we expect them to in the real world.
Right.
And that's the value, I think, of research like this. It
Mhm.
challenges those assumptions and helps us think more critically about the systems that we create.
It's like realizing that constantly watering those wilting plants
Yeah,
might actually be harming the overall health of the garden. We
exactly.
need to make sure we're nurturing the plants that have the most potential,
I love that analogy.
right?
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of directing those resources to the most productive parts of the economy.
So after this deep dive, what's one question you would leave our listeners with?
Oh, that's a good
To
one.
ponder.
Yeah.
Something that builds on what we've discussed, but maybe pushes the conversation even further.
Okay, so here's something to think about. If we accept the premise that these special tax regimes can sometimes hinder overall productivity,
Right.
how can we design tax systems that encourage not just growth, but smart growth? The kind of growth that leads to a more dynamic and innovative economy? It's a really complex challenge,
Yeah,
but I think it's one worth wrestling with.
that's a fantastic question to leave us with.
Yeah,
A reminder that economics is about more than just numbers.
right.
It's about people.
Yeah,
It's about choices.
absolutely.
And it's about creating systems that support real, sustainable progress.
Yeah.
Well, huge thanks to our expert for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of productivity and tax policy
It's my pleasure.
in the Dominican Republic.
Always happy to geek out about this stuff.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought. See you next time.